Great Plains Black History Museum, and we are doing our first virtual Zoom event. Since we can't have you guys come and see us here at the museum, we're bringing the museum to you, and we're bringing it to your home to where you can see the various things in the new exhibit that we've just opened up tonight, which is called Citizenship During the Age of Jim Crow. I want to thank my sponsor, Mutual of Omaha, and the New York Historical Society for providing us this exhibit. We've got some treats over on the side that we'll be getting into after I take you guys on this virtual tour. So if you got any snacks at home and you want to pull that up and eat it and enjoy it while we're going this virtual tour, then come on along and let's see what's going on here at the Great Plains Black History Museum. We're going to start here. Pretty much, unfortunately, there was a time where African Americans were enslaved by European Americans here in the United States. But after the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, we gained our freedom. This here is a photograph of Union soldiers, African American Union soldiers, who they've captured some of the Confederate soldiers. This is on loan to the museum from from Colonel David Washington. He's a friend of the museum, and he's loaned this piece to us as normally part of our veterans exhibit that we have in November. But I thought it would be a good piece to start this particular exhibit off with too. Black citizenship in the age of Jim Crow. Black Americans gained momentum with liberties after the Civil War and at the end of slavery. The era known as the Reconstruction period was born in the 1900s. These liberties had been sabotaged by representatives of the racial system known as Jim Crow. Fighting to belong. Dred and Harriet Scott sued for their freedom from slavery. A lawsuit was filed with the Supreme Court back in 1857. This particular lawsuit was to gain freedom for Dred Scott and his wife Harriet Scott, but unfortunately the Supreme Court struck that case down and would not allow them to be free individuals. Then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, won the presidency. Southern states in favor of expanding slavery seceded and formed the Confederacy, which we know created the Civil War. But in 1863, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed African American men to enlist during the Civil War and fight for the Union. Priorities, once freedom was gained after proclamation and after the Civil War, America was founded on the basic principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Democracy and equality. African Americans newly freed from slavery defined what these concepts meant to them. They took steps they had previously only dreamed of, and often against the determined opposition of European American individuals. Life. They wanted the ability to move freely. Former slaves searched for loved ones once they were freed, and then the ones that had been sold away. Liberty. Free blacks hoped to own land, control their own labor. They believed the federal government should assist them since they had helped build the nation and fight the war. But President Johnson, of course, President Johnson became president shortly after Lincoln was assassinated. President Johnson chose not to redistribute confiscated land to African Americans, instead returning it to former Confederate owners. Most blacks remained poor and economically dependent upon white landowners. The pursuit of happiness. African Americans eagerly sought out opportunities long denied to them. They learned to read and write so they could start businesses, read the Bible, send letters in search of relatives. They built schools, universities, sometimes with help from Northern supporters. They established independent black churches, created a base of social and political power in the process. Democracy and equality. African Americans took to heart the self-evident truth in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Black men exercised their new right to vote and ran for elected office. One of the first individuals elected to the Senate was Heron Revels. He served as the first black senator, one of 2,000 African American office holders during the Reconstruction period. The Reconstruction period begins basically in 1865 and ran until 1870. So little 15 years in which it allowed African Americans to grow and prosper. Just shortly after, I mentioned earlier, just days after the war ended, a Confederate sympathizer killed President Lincoln. Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat and former slave owner, became president. Congress was controlled by the Republicans. Many of them were abolitionists. The White House and Congress began a tug of war over the rights of African Americans and the nation's future. President Johnson treated white South with leniency. He crippled the Freedmen Bureau. This was a group that was established to help formerly enslaved African Americans to own property and own businesses and things like that. They helped support it, but Johnson was against them, and so he did everything in his power to get rid of the Freedmen Bureau. He made it possible for white Southerners to re-elect former Confederates and pass state law restricting black rights. What's interesting, we are the only country who honors and recognizes former Confederate officers and enlisted individuals, and we recognize them as heroes, although they tried to overthrow the government. So no other country that you can go to, you'll find that happens. If you go down south, you'll see various statues and monuments dedicated to the Confederates and individuals that fought against America. Congress responded by placing southern states under military control and enacting civil rights legislation over Johnson's vetoes. Congress also passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This secured equal rights before the law for all and citizenship for anyone born in the United States, including African Americans. As a condition for rejoining the Union, southern states were forced to ratify the 14th Amendment and grant the vote to all their male citizens, regardless of color. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution extended suffrage to black men nationwide. Reconstruction period ending. From 1817 to 1877, the Reconstruction struggle for black freedom and equality produced historic advances through falling short of the hopes of falling short of the hopes for the African Americans. These gains still rose deep hostility among those accustomed to white rule. Southern Democrats took extreme steps to reinstate white supremacy. They ousted black office holders, used violence to threat to stop black men from voting, Little by little, Democrats pushed Republicans out of state government and retook power in the South. At the same time, Northern supporters for Republicans for black rights crumbled, distracted by economic depression. Northerners grew tired of the South's troubles, and they kind of went away. An electoral statement during the 1876 presidential election led to a disastrous compromise. Democrats agreed to support Republican Rutherford Hayes for president. Republicans agreed to withdraw remaining federal troops from the South, basically ending Reconstruction period. 12 years after it begun. During that time, hate groups such as the Klan rose in 1865. This is a road belonging to Joseph Stewart of Tennessee. The Klan was founded in 1865 in order to reinforce white power by terrorizing African Americans. As we know it today, the familiar white robe came a little later, which brings us to here, which is one of the robes in which this robe was discovered in a home here in Nebraska, in the state of Nebraska. The individual that donated to the museum a few years ago, she said it was her grandfather's. Her grandfather had passed away, and she was in the process of cleaning. Now, I have two stories for this. She said she was in the process of cleaning out the attic, and she found it under her floorboard, not knowing that her grandfather was part of the Klan, and she didn't necessarily like this, and she thought she didn't want this to get into the wrong hands, so she actually donated it to the museum. Now, another story is that she found it in the barn of her grandfather's house, and she then decided to donate it to the museum. So I don't know which is correct, but anyhow, it was donated to the museum and donated to Mrs. Bertha Calloway. After the end of the Reconstruction period, brought on what was known as the Jim Crow era. The Jim Crow era started in 1877. It ran through the 1900s. Some might even say it still exists today, but it pretty much ceased to exist in its previous form back in the 1860s. The interesting thing about the Jim Crow period, Jim Crow was named after Thomas Rice. Thomas Rice was the face of Jim Crow. He was born in 1808 in Manhattan, New York, and he actually this was a character he played in vaudeville. And during that time, he would go around in blackface and do a lot of minstrel shows, which created basically what was known as Jim Crow. But now Jim Crow laws was things that were implemented in the South. In some cases, it wasn't actual former laws. It was laws that were basically pseudo laws, things in which you knew not to do. There, in some cases, you would see signs that would say whites only, blacks only, although that was no written law saying that, but that let you know that you weren't supposed to go in there if you were African Americans. If you were an African American. After Reconstruction, a forbidding system of racial discrimination prevailed throughout the country. Jim Crow made it all but impossible for African Americans to exercise their new rights. The South produced the most extreme displays of Jim Crow. Black passengers rode in segregated train cars. Black voters faced high fees that few could pay. In order to vote, you had to pay. Literacy tests were ran. There was another thing that was brought up during that time frame, and we all may be familiar with the term. It's called the grandfather clause. You're familiar with the term the grandfather clause? Well, its origin stems from Jim Crow. And it was set to where if your grandfather was able to vote, then you were granted the right to vote. But in the case of a lot of African Americans who were enslaved, their grandfathers never had that right to vote, so that negated their ability and right to vote. Jim Crow took different forms. Outside the South, and northern businesses flooded the nation with commercial art and goods that presented black people in ridiculous characters, such as you see down here. These falsehoods were legitimized by historians and scientists. While many northern blacks could vote, they faced discrimination in housing and public accommodations. Throughout the country, African Americans resisted Jim Crow ruthless landscape by banding together, fighting back, and taking care of their own. But in 1896, another event that just recently that happened to be the anniversary of was Plessy versus Ferguson. This was a situation where an individual was of African American descent and also of European American descent, and he was riding in the train car, and he felt that he should be able to sit in any place he wanted to, but he was redirected and he was forced to sit in the blacks only section. So he took that to the Supreme Court, and as I said, back in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that public facilities could be segregated on a separate but equal basis. This decision solidified white dominance for years to come. So, which begs to differ, how can you be separate but equal when you didn't have access to the same things? In the schools, most African American schools were given secondary hand-me-down materials, used materials that in most cases came from the white schools. Once they received new materials and new things, those books would then go to the African American schools. From 1900 to 1919, there were a lot of challenges of Jim Crow rules. Jim Crow was firmly entrenched by the 20th century. It was reinforced by a new methodology version of the past known as the lost cause. These ideologies presented the Confederacy as a noble and slavery as benign. Under its widespread influence, monuments to Confederate leaders rose up by the hundreds, and the Ku Klux Klan reemerged. So again, in this situation, the South were able to put up monuments dedicated to the Confederacy. Even though the Confederacy had lost, there was a group of women known as the Daughters of the Confederates who pretty much dictated a lot of the things that children and youth learned in the South as it pertained to history. They basically rewrote history and rewrote the outcome of the Civil War. They wrote it, made it as if it was America trying to impose their will upon the South, and that it was depriving them of their opportunity for the pursuit of happiness. As I mentioned earlier, it was impeding their life, affecting their liberty, and their pursuit of happiness. Blacks' resistance to this oppressive environment took many forms, from Richmond, Virginia headquarters entrepreneur, and we all know her by Maggie C.J. Walker. She provided jobs and community support to African Americans locally and nationally. Also noted scholar W.E.B. Du Bois wrote powerfully against racism and helped found the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. Many thousands of Black Southerners sought relative safety in North and West during the Great Migration period. At one time, the city of Omaha had a very large migration of African Americans, actually west of the Mississippi, we had the largest population of African Americans outside of Los Angeles. And that was because of the packing houses, a lot of African Americans migrating from the South to work in the packing house. In World War I, the Harlem Hellfighters faced down prejudice against black soldiers. If you're not familiar with the Harlem Hellfighters, they were soldiers who their job was to deliver food, supplies, artillery, gas, fuel to the front line. On a day-to-day basis, they would deliver these things. The enemy knew they were coming, and they were carrying explosives, so they were taking risks daily to get those supplies and ammunition to the front line men and individuals. Their valor earned them a place in history. Still, they returned to a country where they could not fully exercise their citizenship. I share with people each year when we put up our African American veterans exhibit, focusing on various African Americans who've served in the military, that African Americans, we have fought in every war and every battle that the United States has had. We've fought in the Revolution. The first person to die in the Revolution, American Revolution, was of African descent, Crispus Attucks. We served during the Civil War. We served during World War I. We served during World War II. We served during various other conflicts, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, all the wars in which this country has ever been in, there's been African Americans serving. And each time we've served with the purpose of gaining our citizenship and acceptance by the U.S. Jim Crow discrimination and violence survived even after World War I. But so did African Americans' determination to crush it. During World War II, African Americans campaigned for fair employment and desegregated military. In 1954, the NAACP legally challenged Brown versus the Board of Education. This landmark Supreme Court decision reversed a half century of separate but equal philosophy, as I mentioned earlier with Plessy versus Ferguson. It struck that down, which basically said that you can't be separate and then be equal. Policies in schools and other facilities were changed. Black Americans and their allies waged a nationwide civil rights movement. The struggle for equality and full citizenship continues to this day. But the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 legalized Jim Crow. These are a few other things in which I wanted to add to the exhibit. The exhibit, as I mentioned earlier, was sponsored by Mutual of Omaha, and then the actual posters that you were looking at were provided by the New York Historical Society. But these are a couple of other pieces that we already had in the museum that I thought would really go well with this exhibit. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the movie 12 Years a Slave, but this book here is a first edition publication of the book published by Solomon Northrop, published back in 1853. Now, if you remember, slavery did not end until 1865. So this book predates the proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation. And this is a first edition copy of the book. I also thought this would be a fitting piece. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In this, it says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Whereas disregard and incompetence for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind and the advent of a world in which human rights shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and what has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse at least as at last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations. The people of the United Nations have in the Charter reaffirmed that faith in fundamental rights, in the dignity and worth of human person, and in the equal rights of men and women, and have determined to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. And there's other parts of this act, but I really think that this piece really ties in with citizenship. Also, we're all familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King. This is his I Have a Dream speech. I'm not going to read that because I don't think I would be giving it the justice that it needs, that it deserves in reading it. Also, Frederick Douglass' great 4th of July speech, in which he talks about the celebration of the 4th of July and what it means to black folk. And by any means necessary, which is a speech which is a saying or quote said by Malcolm X. Now, the reason I think all these pieces really go with this because they were all focused on the same thing. And another interesting thing is they all have an Omaha, Nebraska connection that a lot of people may not be aware of. They all have visited the city of Omaha in one time or another. Frederick Douglass visited Omaha back in 1893-94 timeframe. Dr. Martin Luther King visited Omaha 2 times back in 1958 and then again in 1961. And then, of course, we all know that Malcolm X was born in Omaha and he visited Omaha throughout his life. And now I'm just going to have you, we're just going to walk through, let you kind of look at the exhibit there, and then we'll open it up for questions. All right, guys, thank you. Sorry, I saw some of you guys in the queue, and it looks like you were waiting to get in and you missed out. So what I'll do is in probably about another 10, 15 minutes, and I'll if you did not see the tour, first I will open it up and I will walk through it again. And it'll probably be better the second time because I've had a chance to kind of settle down and relax and get more prepared because you know how with new technology, if you're not good at it, it sometimes takes you a while to get things going, and it took us a while to get things going. So, but I do want to share some things with you guys about the museum and our mission. Our mission is to preserve, celebrate, and educate all people of the contribution and achievements of African Americans throughout the Great Plains of America. Today, we are the only museum in the state of Nebraska focused on the rich history of African Americans. And our goal with as I mentioned earlier, since we can't have you actually come down to the museum, we're trying to provide an opportunity for you guys to still check out the museum and see what's going on through our virtual tours. We'll be providing these throughout from this point on pretty much, and we'll also be having various workshops focusing on African American history as well. And we hope that you guys will share this information with people and join in on these and share it on Facebook Live. But what I'm going to do now, because I do have a little bit more time, is I'm going to walk you guys through the exhibit again and focus on the various things that that the exhibit has to offer. And then also let you know that we do have some more exhibits coming up. Next new exhibit that will be opening, and that will probably be opening up in July. Time frame will be the Negro League Baseball, which will focus on African Americans in the Negro League prior to being able to play in what is now known as the Major League Baseball. So we'll have that exhibit, and we'll also have presentations discussing that particular subject. So I'm going to kind of walk you through again. If I can also ask, if you're on here via Zoom or if you're on here via Facebook Live, if you can leave just in the message area the state in which you're from, or where you're from, so that way we can see how many people we've reached and then how many people we can potentially reach in the future. So thank you. And I'm starting the exhibit from the beginning, pretty much. Black citizenship during in the age of Jim Crow. Of course, we know the Civil War was fought in the 1860s, ending in 1865, which is basically when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln. In 1860 was when the Civil War began, and fighting to belong. Basically, prior to the war, back in 1857, Dred and Harriet Scott sued for their freedom. Their case made it all the way to the Supreme Court back in 1857, and it was struck down. The justice decided against him. He was saying that he could not sue because he was not a citizen of the United States. Further, they ruled that no African American could ever be a U.S. citizen. This decision angered abolitionists and emboldened slave owners and widening the breach between the North and the South, basically resulting in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, as the Republican president, creating the Civil War. In 1863, the Union opened their doors to allowing African Americans to serve in the Union to fight during the Civil War. And in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation allowed African Americans to be considered free and fight in the Civil War. Following the Union's victory in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution permanently abolished slavery in the United States, but the Dred Scott decision still barred Black Americans from U.S. citizenship. During this time, African Americans, just like any other individual in the United States, they wanted what the Constitution offered: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With African Americans being able to move freely, former slaves searched for loved ones who had been sold during enslavement. They chose their own surnames and decided where to build their new lives. Couples made unrecognized marriage official. Liberty, free blacks hoped to own land and control their own labor. They believed that federal government should assist them since they had helped build the nation and fight the war. But President Johnson, who became president after the assassination of President Lincoln, chose not to redistribute confiscated land to African Americans, instead returning them to former Confederate owners. Most blacks remained poor and economically dependent upon white landowners. In their pursuit of happiness, African Americans eagerly sought out opportunities for long denied them. They learned to read and write so they could start business, read the Bible and send letters in search of relatives. They built their own schools, universities, and sometimes, with help from the Northern supporters, they established independent churches, creating a base of social and political power in the process. Reconstruction period, which occurred back in
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the virtual exhibit. That was different. Let me think is it too close? Let me get in the car, y'all. Let me get in the car before I get ran over. Get in the car. I'm in busy street. See if I can get the. Okay. Woo! Ah! Woo! I'm about to die now. Wearing this mask the whole time. Oh Jesus! Can y'all see me? Okay. Okay, y'all. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Where I was at, for those of y'all who didn't catch the beginning, was at the Great Plains Black History Museum in Omaha, Nebraska, off of 24th and Burdette, near 24th and Lake Street, for those of y'all who are in Omaha and for some reason been sleeping under a rock your whole life and don't know where that museum is. But I think everybody pretty much knows where that Black History Museum is. But yes, so thanks to everybody who was tuning in. Actually, I originally wasn't going to be at the event because I have a lot of stuff to do today. I had to work, and then the place where I just came from, you know, where the event was held, they had reached out to me like a few days back and asked me could I make a cake for the event. So if you were following along, you might have saw me show the cake for a quick second. The cake that I made, which I posted on my Facebook page, my Tanya's Delight Slice by Slice cake decorating page on Facebook. But yeah, so that was really cool. I mean, other stuff that we were taught in history growing up, you know, it wasn't everything that we were supposed to know. I think back in the day, they barely touched the surface on a lot of things, especially, you know, I don't know how it is for y'all down there in the South. Maybe they go a little more in depth because y'all down there in the South where, a lot of the slavery went, plantations, and, Jim Crow and all that kind of stuff. But up here in the Midwest in Omaha, Nebraska, they barely touched the surface. So that was kind of cool for me to go down there. They told me, since you got a YouTube channel, why don't you go live from down here after you drop the cake off? And I'm thinking, okay, I guess that'll give me a little time still in between because we have our Friday night live that we do on Friday nights that don't start till 9. So I'm like, okay, I can do that. So that was pretty cool. I'm glad they invited me to do that, to make the cake, and I felt honored just to make the cake. It's an honor whenever businesses like that, request my service, and most people request me from hearsay, and a lot of people that I cater to is just friends and family, and every now and then a big company or organization hit me up, be like, I heard about you, can you make us a cake? So I was honored to make a cake for the Great Plains Black History Museum, that's been around, and then to go ahead and do the live so you guys can see the virtual exhibit. I done been to museums before, but this is kind of different, and the reason why they wanted to do it was because they have been planning, like a lot of people planning to do certain things this spring, this summer, and because of COVID, a lot of people is not trying to get out and about, and on top of that, a lot of establishments is not trying to have more than like 10 people in there. So that's why they decided to do the virtual exhibit, which I hope everybody enjoyed. They limited Black history. Yes, they limited Black history in school. And like I said, I don't know how it was back in the day, down south. And I have a feeling that even if they did limit the Black studies or Black history back in the day down south, that because a lot of people who are from the South are rooted in the South, some people still live on plantations that they worked on. Some people, they still drive by the locations where their parents used to pick cotton and stuff like that. And they have a little bit more history and a little bit more knowledge closer to the source, closer to what people really went through. Up here in Omaha, it's like, okay, my grandma, my great grandma, everybody up here. So it's like, I don't know, sometimes in the Black families it seems like when you're young your parents talk to you about certain things and certain stuff, and as you get older it's like those conversations don't happen anymore. So I'm gonna have to even me myself personally, I know that to be true in my family. When we were growing up, we talked about all kind of stuff about history, but then as we got older, it just went away. Then when you have kids, they go to school and they don't learn everything. The kids today, they don't learn everything. So it's important to make sure that they know their history, their full history. Sure, know who made what. Who really made the stoplights, things like that. But yeah, you said you went and looked at the cake. Trying not to take my eyes off the road. You said that was nice. You were able to provide cake, sir. Yeah, that's what I was supposed to do today, just provide a cake. But I was like, I think I'll stay. And I think I'll watch the exhibit. And he told me I could go live and post it on YouTube. And I was like, okay, cool. So yeah, so again, make sure you guys like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, and don't forget we have a Facebook group called the Hood Table. It's a private Facebook group. You can join it if you like. But other than that, I'm about to get my butt home. I need to get ready for our show tonight. There's some topics that we're going to be discussing tonight on Friday Night Live. And as usual, if you want to jump on the StreamYard with us, jump on the StreamYard and on the screen with us. We can have up to 6 people. So let me know if you want to jump on the stream with us and talk about some stuff, or if you got some to talk about for Friday Night Live. And on that note, you guys, stay safe, be blessed. Yes, you said you really did enjoy. Yes, the true Black history. I'm sorry, I'm not getting all y'all comments because I'm like You know, I'm driving. But yes, I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. And you guys stay blessed, be safe, stay healthy. And I will see y'all at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time for Friday Night Live at the Hood Table. I'm out. Deuces.